Welcome everybody to this event on behalf of the English department and Kali Fajardo-Anstine. Here's the plan. I'm going to introduce Kali and give you a little background on her career and say some nice things about her, because it seems to me that she should hear a lot of nice things about how much her work is loved. And then Kali's going to read for us. Then she and I will follow that up with a short conversation. And then we'll open up that conversation to your thoughts and questions, which you can deliver to me through Zoom's chat function. And those of you not wearing your favorite outfits should know that the event is being recorded. Kali Fajardo-Anstine is from our American West, Denver, Colorado, and got her MFA from the University of Wyoming, and has seen her fiction and nonfiction appear in, among other places, Elle, the Oprah Magazine, the American Scholar, the Boston Review, the Bellevue Literary Review, the Idaho Review, and Southwestern American Literature. Wow, Jim, you say, that's pretty impressive, but I say, wait, there's more. Her first collection of stories, SABRINA and CORINA, won an American Book Award and the Reading the West Award from the Mountains and Plains Independent Booksellers Association. Say that fast 3 times. Was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Penn Bingham Prize, and the Story Prize, was shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize, and was longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize. You will be unsurprised at this point then to learn that it was named one of the best books of 2019 by a dizzying array of discerning associations, including Kirkus Reviews, the Library Journal, and the New York Public Library. Kali was also the 2019 recipient of the Denver Mayor's Award for Global Impact in the Arts. And when she hasn't been making Denver proud, she's lived almost any place that sounds like it promises adventure, from Durango to Key West. But none of that explains why I grab people by the collar and tell them that, hey, you got to read this woman's work. I love her work for its dedication to showing us with a fierce rigor and an infinite tenderness worlds and lives that routinely get elided when it comes to America's sense of itself. Families and communities, in this case, Indigenous Latina, outside the dominant culture and paying for it, with the kinds of deprivation in which for your birthday, you might receive a shoebox inside of which is a sheet of paper on which your mother has written, "Once I get a job, this will be whatever you want." Or for Christmas, your stocking might be filled with the kind of gifts that no one wants, but everyone needs: socks, floss, chapstick. Her protagonists deal as best they can with that unhappy overlap of having been dealt a bad hand and having occasionally misplayed it. And what's striking in the work is how often, for all of its compassion, it refuses to let its protagonists off the hook, staying true to Aristotle's reminder that literature concerns itself with flaws of character that produce flaws of judgment, for which the characters must take responsibility. Kali writes spectacularly well about women who have to deal with other women who are feckless or absent, or mothers who blow into their daughters' lives only during their ecstatic breaks from what otherwise seem to be perpetual sadness. Women caught in their own undercurrents, who leave their daughters or sisters that impossible choice of either saving themselves or standing by loved ones who refuse to stop self-destructing. It's no wonder then that those sisters and daughters have problems with weariness, or a tendency to binge, or a certain slipperiness. They have to remind themselves that sometimes someone's unhappiness can make them forget that they're a part of something bigger, like a family or a people. For all sorts of good reasons, then, history is not their favorite subject. But they stay a part of the world. They take things personally. They know that giving the gift of attention will re-immerse them in life. And they understand how politicizing compassion really is. And like Alicia, the protagonist of her story, All Her Names, who when tagging trains is exhilarated at seeing her signature appear as if she had uncovered it beneath the dirty metal. They know that the act of making it is itself a great consolation, and that act will help them learn that there is no shame in the damage done to them, and that it might enable others who are facing what they've faced to see themselves in that kind of writing, and so be moved to generate their own. Ladies and gentlemen, I love her work, and I am thrilled to present to you Kali Fajardo-Anstine. You're up, Kali.
Wow, Jim, thank you so much. That's how an intro is done. I am always going to remember this. Thank you. That was so beautiful. Before I read, I do have to say that your work, Jim, has been very important to me. When I was learning to write stories, which I still feel like I'm learning everything all the time, every day, your work was at the top of my list. Oh. Thank you for writing, so people like me can learn how to write better.
We should tell the students that this is what's known as log rolling.
Well, I'm also, one of my mentors studied with Charles Baxter at Michigan, and so okay. I got a lot of stuff like put into me without even knowing you. So thank you, thank you. So tonight I think I'm going to read a little bit from Sugar Babies, because I was going to read just from sad stories from Sisters and Sabrina and Corina, but I think I'll give you a little bit of Sugar Babies and then I'll go Sabrina and Corina.
Right.
Because it's not, I don't know if it's like fun for audiences to just hear like downer stories all the time, but I do recommend reading them, though I will not be reading Sisters today. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the beginning of Sugar Babies. Though the southern Colorado soil was normally hard and cakey, it had snowed and then rained an unusual amount that spring. Some of the boys in my 8th grade class decided it was the perfect ground for playing Army. They borrowed shovels and picks from their father's sheds, placing the tools on their bicycle handlebars and riding out to the western edge of our town, Cewarita, a place where the land with its silken fibers of swaying grass resembled a sleeping woman with her face pressed firmly to the pillow, a golden blonde by day, a raven-haired beauty by night. The first boy to hit bone was Robbie Martinez. He did so with the blunt edge of a rusted shovel. Out of the recently drenched earth, he lifted a piece of the brittle, faded whiteness and tossed it downwind like it were nothing more than a scrap of paper. Look, he said, kneeling as if he was praying. Everybody, come look. The other boys gathered around. There in the ground lay broken pieces of bowls with black zigzagging designs. Next to those broken bowls were human teeth, scattered like dried kernels of yellow corn. Above them, the sun had begun to fade behind the tallest peak of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The sky was pale and bleak, like the bloated belly of a lizard passing above. Don't touch it, Robbie said. None of it. We need to tell somebody. Until they did, the entire town, everyone it seemed, was a witness. Days after their discovery, our final 8th grade project was announced. We gathered in the gym for an assembly. The teachers brought together the boys from technical education class and the girls from home economics. We sat Indian style in 10 rows beneath dangling ropes and resting basketball hoops. The room smelled like a tennis ball dipped in old socks, and the cement walls were padded in purple vinyl, supposedly to minimize dodgeball injuries, but I thought it looked like a loony bin. Mrs. Sharpley, a bug-eyed woman with a neck like a giraffe but a torso like a rhino's, stood before us on a wooden box. For the remaining 2 weeks of your junior high careers, she said, you will care for another human life. She then reached behind her into a paper grocery bag, revealing a sack of C&H pure cane sugar. Sugar babies, she said, we will be raising our very own sugar babies. Older kids had gossiped about notorious school projects. We had heard stories of piglet dissections, the infamous growing and changing unit, rocket launches with carbon dioxide canisters, and a cow's lung blackened and doused in cigarette smoke. But no one had warned us about sugar babies. Sugar babies are a lot of responsibility, Mrs. Sharpley said as she stepped down from her box and paced with the sugar sack. She explained we were to be graded on skills like feeding, bonding, budgeting, and more. She then passed around diaper directions. We do it all alone. It was Selana Segura. She was behind me, her perpetual whimper causing every sentence to end like a little howl. Like single moms and stuff. Somewhere down the rows, a boy croaked. But the DNA shows I am not the father. We chirped with laughter until Mrs. Sharpley held up 2 fingers, signaling silence. Of course not, she said. You will be in committed partnerships. We're drawing names. A teacher's aide in Payless Flats scurried like a magician's assistant toward Mrs. Sharpley. She carried 2 Folgers cans decorated in pink and blue glitter. Mrs. Sharpley set down her sugar, taking the cans from the aide and giving each a good shake. From the pink can, the first name she pulled was Mimi Yazzie, who stood and slinked forward, bearing her face into her arms as Miss Sharpley called out her partner, Mike Ramos. This cycle of humiliation lasted for several more rounds before I was partnered with Roberto Martinez, the Bone Boy. After school, Robbie and I sat outside on the swings. He was a scrawny kid with frequently chapped lips and a light dusting of freckles across his low nose. He played soccer and always wore a beat-up blue windbreaker and knockoff Adidas sneakers, the kind with 4 stripes instead of 3. The sugar baby was planted snug in his lap, balanced ever so gently between his 2 stick arms. His dark eyes were so big and wide, they resembled 2 brown pigeon eggs, and he spoke with a quavering, squeaky voice. They said we have to name it. Do you want to pick it out, Sierra? No, you name it. I swung up. And you take it home tonight. I swung down. I'll watch it tomorrow, but only if I have to. That's cool, he said. What about Miranda? That's my grandma's name. Whatever, I sighed, leaning back on the swing. Name it after your grandmother. Name it after your entire family. I don't care. I pumped until the rusted chain pulled taut. Then I jumped, landing in the mushy gravel with both feet. I took off for home. Ain't that something, my father said, as he and I ate breakfast the next morning. On our small black and white TV above the microwave, aerial shots of the dig site were being shown on the news. The land appeared as an enormous shadow box with scrapes of ancient people instead of thimbles and porcelain knickknacks. Can we go see it, I asked, spooning my last bit of cornflakes into my mouth. I suspect they don't want us to do that, my father said, keeping his eyes to the television. There were deep lines around his eyelids, his hair was purely silver, and his hands were spotted from years as working as a roofer beneath the Colorado sun. People had begun to mistake him for my grandfather. Why not, I asked. We should be allowed. I walked to the sink and I tossed my dirty dish inside. It's where we're from. It's our people. My father scratched his chin. There was a thin turquoise ring on his finger where there had once been a gold wedding band. Don't leave a dish in the sink, he said. How many times I got to tell you that, Sierra? I turned back and soaped up my bowl. I mean it. I want to go. Things like this have always happened around here, he said. It's nothing special. I told my father that it was new to me as I scrubbed my dish with the green and yellow sponge, the milky water gargling loudly down the drain's black rubber lips. As I rinsed the bowl once more, I peered through the window above the sink. The morning was clear, and in the distance, the mountains were crystal blue like an enormous wave. As if sailing across those waters, a small white pickup truck with a front end bra pulled down our street and rumbled over the gravel in our driveway. Long, dark hair clouded the truck's windshield, and very red, very long fingernails were coiled around the steering wheel. A silver rosary dangled above the dash. Papa, I called over my shoulder, drying my hands on my jeans. My father rose and stood tall behind me, smelling of leather and dirt. Looks like she's back again, he said. He grunted some, swishing spit around inside his mouth before shooting a stream of yolky bile into the sink. Go outside, Sierra. Say hello to your mother. My mother first left 3 years earlier. It happened one morning after she cooked breakfast. I watched as she gathered her keys and coat and walked into our wintry yard without any shoes. She left footprints as slight as bird tracks in the snow. When I asked my father later why she had left, he simply said, sometimes a person's unhappiness can make them forget they are part of something bigger, something like a family, a people, even a tribe. My mother occasionally would come home for a day or two to gather forgotten necklaces or purses, though over time my father moved her things from the bedroom to a box in the crawl space. Her visits were infrequent enough that I learned to live without her. It wasn't easy at first. Sometimes I'd hear a funny story at school or church, and my first thought would be, you have to tell Mama. But over time, that urge to be with her, to tell her things, to be part of her, it went away, just like she always did. Okay, and I'll stop from sugar babies there. I was thinking about this today. I really had to raise a sugar baby in 6th grade, and I just can't believe that is still haunting me for like the rest of my life now. I will be talking about that sugar baby forever. So that I'm going to read now from the titular story, Sabrina and Corina. This story, the reason why people always ask why is the book titled Sabrina and Corina. I really liked invoking that, Fanny and Alexander, Franny and Zoe, that kind of thing. But I feel like Sabrina and Corina of all the stories really speaks to the theme of this collection and like the heart of this collection. So I usually try to read a little bit from Sabrina and Corina. So what you need to know, this is the middle of the story at some point. At the beginning of the story, Sabrina has been strangled to death by a man, and her former best friend and cousin, Corina, is a makeup artist who has been asked by the family if she will do the makeup on Sabrina's body for the funeral. And this is a flashback section. We were inseparable in high school. Sabrina was my best friend, my closest cousin. My father would give me a hard time, ask if I ever tired of carrying her dead weight, but Sabrina was fun. She was vivid and felt everything deeply. From heartbreak to the drunken nights, we stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning, mapping out our tiny lives with enormity only Sabrina could imagine. To her, everything was possible. Money, true love, a way out of Colorado. Even after she dropped out in 11th grade to work at a sports bar downtown, I used to do homework in a back booth, marveling at the way she glided between tables, sleek and fluid with her long black hair curled around her elegant neck. Men would follow her between their bites of onion rings and beer-battered fish, insatiable as if my cousin were just another symptom of their hunger. After graduation, my father offered to pay for cosmetology school. He said that I needed to do something besides run around like other Cordova women. He mostly meant Sabrina, of course, who by that point had started showing up to family dinners, smelling like a barroom floor. But it wasn't just her. There was the distant niece whose infant son was taken away by the state, great Auntie Dodie left blind after a date with the wrong man, the cousins who died messing around with heroin, and Auntie Liz, found dead in her Chrysler, the motor running, and the garage door locked. My grandmother hardly mentioned Auntie Liz, except to say what had killed her had killed them all. While I was studying cuts and colors, perms, and relaxers, Sabrina continued working in bars and sleeping with men who all looked alike, tall, thick-necked, green eyes or blue. In my mind, these men formed a lineup of indifferent masculine faces, a continuation of the withdrawn expression I had seen on those old photographs of Sabrina's father. Sometimes Sabrina would visit me at the beauty college. She would stand at my station in wrinkled clothes, looking like she'd just woken up at noon. While the other girls snickered and popped their gum, Sabrina would scoop away her hair, and I'd see the bruises, hickeys like rotten goose eggs all down her throat. "They'll send me home from work," she'd say, and I always helped her conceal everything. After finishing beauty school, I rented a studio apartment on the west side that overlooked an abandoned public pool. At night, on my second floor balcony, I'd sit and I'd wonder about the missing diving board, replaced with an orange traffic cone, as if that could somehow stop someone from leaping headlong into hard cement. It was a lonely place, and Sabrina only visited during the rare times when she was single. She'd come over and shadow me throughout the apartment, like a child who was afraid she'd stop existing if someone wasn't there to see her. You ever do makeovers on women who look hideous without makeup? She asked. She was sitting on the lid of my toilet with 2 Coronas between her thighs, one for each of us. We had the radio on an oldie station, the type of music our moms played when we were little girls and they would drive us through the mountains in the summertime. Sure, I said, smiling, but after I fix them up, nobody can tell. I guess only they can. Sabrina checked her reflection, smudging her berry lip liner with her left pinky. And of course, you. We went to a bar on the edge of the city that night, near a highway overpass. Neon signs hung in the foggy windows. We played a couple games of pool and drank shots of cheap tequila, and every now and then Sabrina danced over to the old school jukebox and flipped through the records, the light flickering over her face. I sat at the bar and I watched a group of men circle around her. They held their beers close to their chest and waited for an opportunity to move in like vultures. "We're going outside for a cigarette," Sabrina said. And 2 pale-faced guys with those broad shoulders and those thick necks stood behind her, nervously casting glances my way, as if afraid I'd ruin their fun. "But you don't smoke," I said. "I picked it up," she said, "just now." I watched the front window as she stepped outside and flopped against a parked minivan, twisting her hair around her fingers, her smile all teeth. The men stood next to her, packing their smokes. Neither was in her league. But Sabrina had a way of talking to men like she was a gift, an offering of an expressive, pretty face and a girlish giggle. It didn't matter who it was, so long as they gave her attention back. And after a while, I couldn't watch her anymore. "That your sister?" the bartender asked, glancing out the window. "Not my sister," I said, and looked at Sabrina tossing her hair back, the cords of her neck forming a chute to her collarbones. "She's my cousin." "I knew you two were related." He poured tequila and set it before me. "You look similar." "Not really," I said, and swallowed my shot. When Sabrina hobbled back inside, she could hardly stand in her wedge platforms. The men guided her by the wrist, and she swayed between them until they released her grip, and Sabrina leaned over me, her perfume gone rancid with hints of rotten fruit, something that belongs in the trash. "Corina, Corina," she said. "Having fun?" And I glared at the 2 guys beside her. They were far less drunk than Sabrina, beaming with pride, as if they had already gotten her into a cab and headed for one of their apartments. "Let's get going," I said. Sabrina squinted at me. Tiny wrinkles begun to form around her eyes and lips. "You can leave me here," she said. "I'll get home okay." With my hands firmly around her wrist, I towed her to the front door. The 2 men laughed, backed off, and began to circle another girl a few stools down. The bartender pulled the white washcloth over the bar, eyeing the 2 of us while we left with what I thought was pity. "Let's go." I was gripping Sabrina's wrist harder than necessary, and she wobbled behind me and she squeezed tighter and angrier, and I was worried my nails would mark her skin. "Don't you care how people look at you?" And outside, the air was cool, the moon surrounded by a thin cloud, and I kept dragging Sabrina to the car as she tottered behind me, her face to the sky like that of a dreamy child. And when she finally let go and I steadied her against my trunk, opening her blue eyes wide, Sabrina said, "They look at us the same way, Corina." She laughed and pointed in my face. "They look at us like we're nothing." And I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much, Kali. You should imagine thunderous applause instead of a bunch of forlorn little thumbnails. How's that?
Oh, I can see you guys. I can see your claps. Thank you.
There you go. You can see the
Thank
clapping.
you all so much.
Okay, this is part 2 that we promised them, right? Which is the conversation between human beings.
Yeah, yeah.
You said you wanted to talk about the form of short stories?
I mean, I love the short story form, and my next book that I'm readily finishing right now is not a short story. It's a very long story. And yeah, I love the short story form, and I assume many of the students are writing short stories right now. And so I thought it would be beneficial if we talked about, some of the joys and pleasures and also the frustrations of this particular form.
Who's sweeter than you when it comes to helping people out, right? Well, let's start with some of the places you learned to do what you do. It seemed to me, especially with something like Sabrina and Corina, you can see the effect of somebody like Alice Munro on your work. In terms of the way you sort of have learned the evocative manipulation of time so that you can go in a really lovely way from the granular moment by moment stuff to huge leaps. I mean, we all love that about Munro, the way we'll be stuck in this little moment seemingly, and then suddenly, it'll say 45 years later and we'll all like jump, right? Was Munro a big influence on you?
Yeah, it's funny because Munro came along when I was already in my second MFA, and I like to let people know that not only did I drop out of high school and get a GED, I also dropped out of my first MFA program. So if you're like a big failure like I was, it's okay. But I had been introduced to Alice Munro pretty early, but I didn't start enjoying or reading her until my MFA at the University of Wyoming. I was a bookseller from the time I was 15 until in my 30s. And the owner of the bookstore where I worked, Lois, she gave me a paperback copy. I think it was The Beggar Maid or something. And I was like, I don't want this book about these white women in Canada. I just was like, no, I have no interest in this.
Right.
And so she kept pleading with me and I wouldn't read it. But one of my mentors when I was in Wyoming, Radowit Lapsharon-Sop is his name. He one day presented me with the collected stories of Munro. And he said, I really think that you need to start reading her and, sort of studying her work. And at that time, I had gotten really interested in Edward P. Jones. And I was noticing in Lost in the City how Jones was manipulating time. Mm-hmm. And then when I rediscovered Munro in this way, I was hooked and I thought this is the epitome of, time travel and fiction. But then I started going back and I recently was rereading sections of 100 Years of Solitude, which I loved as a teenager. And I realized, oh my gosh, I've been drawn to this kind of work for a long time.
Right. And I assume Jones was a big influence on your sense of how place can impact fiction as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. So around the same time that I was exposed to Lost in the City, I had been reading Rock Springs by Richard Ford. And I was starting to understand that you could spotlight where you come from, even if you don't come from New York City. And for some reason, because all the books are published there, right. I was exposed mostly to stories that were set in these metropolitan coastal cities. And I realize I had a lot of insecurity about setting work where I grew up. Mm-hmm. And so it took writers like Edward P. Jones to show me that wow, your community might be a niche community that might be a submerged population group inside of this larger group, but you are still allowed to set your stories there. And they're going to be just as vital as, the stories that are tackling these large subject matter and the coastal cities.
Right. Did it seem like it affected the shape of the stories in any way, or is it just a matter of getting permission to write about your world?
I think it did. I think that's not something I ever thought about until you just asked this question, Jim.
Penetrating. This is penetrating.
Yes, because I love being able to describe place. I love it. It's so pleasurable for me mm-hmm. to look at the landscape where my ancestors have been living for all of history. Some of my ancestors, I'm very mixed. I love being able to walk around the city and to think about the architecture and the layers of architecture and time periods in Denver. And so I do think that my work has these moments that really slow down for mm-hmm. place-based description. So yeah, that's definitely impacted the overall structure of my work.
Yeah, I would have said the same thing. It's interesting to have you put it that way, because you can feel these moments in your fiction where your characters look around and go, this is a lot of open space, and we're going to take some time to look at it. So we're not going any faster than this, essentially, right?
Yeah, I love it.
It's also a nice corrective for them because they're so often, as you were saying, coming from sadness or coming from some sort of trauma, and that sense they have that the world can reinvigorate them or recharge them is really crucial to your work, I think, in a lot of ways. If you can really feel them going, I got to get outside and look at the sky for a minute or something like that.
Yeah, so my ancestral homelands would be northern New Mexico, Taos area, all the way up and through southern Colorado. And I remember the first time I went on a solo trip with my sister. She was 18 and I was 15. we drove down there for a ceremony, and I had been really struggling with depression like my whole life. I'm one of those people that just had it as a child. Um, and I remember like feeling the embrace of the land and just feeling this sense of home. And now I realize that there's entire bodies of like scholarly work dedicated to what it means to have this longing sense of homeland. But yeah, it's definitely, it's just such a pleasurable aspect to be able to talk about where I come from now.
Yeah, I bet. You mentioned Garcia Marquez. Are you drawn to some of the non-naturalists as well? Were there people that not doing realism that you found yourself nourished by?
Yeah, I think, I mean, sometimes I think of like Beloved has like a ghost main character. So I would say it's realism, but it also has that element. I was really drawn to Jose Saramago or Saramago. I don't know if I'm pronouncing him correctly.
You make the call.
I don't know. Blindness came out. I don't remember. I was working at the bookstore. I was still a teenager, and then I just started devouring his work. And my next book has more. I wouldn't call them supernatural elements. They're just elements of storytelling that feel realist to me, but I guess they're not real.
Right.
So I'm drawn to it, and I think it's when you come from a non-dominant or Anglo-centric culture, oftentimes you're in conversation with spirits and ghosts and things of that nature. Your mom has dreams that, you know, will come true.
Right.
And so I don't really consider it non-realist, but it is part of, I think my work will be going more in that direction in the future.
And do you think does your novel draw something tonally from Blindness? Does it have that kind of fierce matter-of-factness?
Well, no, it's not pedantic. But it's, that was like when I was like bookselling, they'd be like, people were like, I don't want to read this if it's like teaching me a moral.
Right.
It's set in the 30s and in the 1890s, so it has noir elements. I'm really influenced by film. Mm-hmm. So I actually was like setting my editor like movie posters from Japan for Chinatown. And I was like, this is what I want as the next cover, because they let me pick the artist for my cover.
That's pretty great.
Yeah, it is pretty great. But it's a very atmospheric novel. That's what I love reading. So that's what I hope I want to produce.
So should we imagine you watching noirs as a very young child?
Yes, you should do that. That is, yeah, I mean, my dad was a big film buff. And so like you go into the laundry room and he had like a statue of Humphrey Bogart that was like made of porcelain that was like really scary.
A porcelain Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah. And like, okay. So I was around, you know, look at this beautiful architecture and like a smoking vixen. It's like really interesting to me. I love Blade Runner.
So you like powerful women who scare people, is what you're saying? Yes,
I do. Yeah, I was just like Rachel from Blade Runner is like one of my favorites.
Right, and the fact that she turns out not to be human is a plus in this case, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like. I like in the novel, the Rachel in the novel throws a sheep or something off a roof, and it's like one of my favorite scenes ever.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the form, getting back to the form, what when you were trying to write stories, what gave you the most trouble? What aspects of craft gave you the most trouble?
Oh my God! In the beginning, it was everything. In the beginning, it was the stamina to learn how to revise and to learn how to rewrite, because I've always been somebody who's filled with storytelling and filled with ideas, and it was just so hard for me because I was not a traditionally good student. I mean, the reason I dropped out of high school is because I had like a 1.7 GPA. so I'm somebody who just has like no rigor when it comes to like, I had to teach myself that from scratch. But I remember I had written a draft of Any Further West, and I turned it into a mentor of mine at the University of Wyoming. And he said, this is great. I love this mom character and I love this little girl. Now go rewrite this whole story. And I thought he was nuts. Why would I rewrite a story? Right. And I had to read a lot of craft books and sort of educate myself. And like, this is what real writing is for me now, is revision.
So sitting there and confronting the mess you made took a little bit more discipline and a little bit more, yeah, okay, I get the idea. What about the issues of minimalism, the spareness of some of your work? Were you influenced by those sorts of people?
Yeah, I thought you might ask about this, Jim. I have like a kind of a funny story about it. So when I had my first marketing meeting in New York City, where I met my editor, the head of my imprint, he said, "Well, Kali, do you know that what you write is out of fashion?" I said, I said, what do you mean? And he's like, you're like clearly influenced by the Dirty Realist. Like what you write is out of fashion. And I said, I know, but nobody knows. So
Right.
like, it's just like, but yeah,
Did you point out that all of literature is out of fashion, so it really doesn't matter?
yeah, well, yeah, exactly. The moment, yeah, nobody likes novels.
Right.
But no, I really, it sort of happened in like a strange trajectory. So I used to go to a lot of punk shows and noise shows in warehouses in Denver, and nobody at the bookstore was telling me to read Ann Beattie or Joy Williams or anyone from that school. What happened was I read an interview with the front man of a band I liked called Shoo Shoo, and he said that he was reading Drown by Junot Diaz. And so I bought a copy of Drown, and then I found out that Junot Diaz was really influenced by Dennis Johnson. And then it sort of led to this like trickle of like, I would just read interviews upon interviews. And that's when I started getting interested in Richard Ford. And then I started moving back in time and going into Catherine Ann Porter, who I feel like is part of that minimalistic style too. But yeah, it became like this huge web around me, and I actually had to like kind of break out of it. Like I was only reading that kind of work for a long time.
It is interesting how much as a young writer you think, oh, I don't need that stuff. I just need what's right in front of me here. And then you go, oh, it turns out my hero had a hero. Yeah. And her hero had a hero, and her hero had a hero. And so you just keep working your way backward and often confronting those people that you didn't think you were going to confront. But it's almost impossible now to get through an MFA without somebody putting Alice Munro in front of you, I think probably is the way. And Dennis Johnson, right? I mean, yeah. He's also now, did you end up having to read him for somebody else at Wyoming, or did you only
No, I found a copy of Jesus' Son and My Parents on the bookshelf when I was in high school.
Oh, good for them.
They had a first edition, and I read Emergency. And like my mom was a poet. She never published, but she self-published children's books, but she's a voracious reader, and my father too. So I'm very lucky because I had sort of an education in literature at home, but they had no idea how like to send me off into the business side and like go become a writer. Like it was just like, here are all the books, here are all the tools.
And did sort of seeing the kind of funny self-destructiveness of somebody like the fuckhead and Georgie in Emergency ring a bell?
I mean, I think if you look at Sabrina, she might have some
a little
quality.
Bit of that, yeah.
It showed me that like I can have drug addicts and I can have alcoholics and I can have partiers, and they can be the stars of literature. And you know, it's sometimes like we think of literature as it's reserved for some sort of cultural elite, but all of our stories fit into it. It's so dramatic. Come on.
Yeah, there is that moment, you know, where you feel so empowered when you think to yourself, so this is allowed too. You can write about this as well, right? It doesn't have to be Henry James in his drawing room necessarily, right?
Yeah, I think I felt that. I mean, I still feel that when I give readings from this book, I'm like, I can't believe they want to hear about the makeup girl at Macy's. Like they do. They want to hear about her.
Okay, I'm going to give you an opportunity to get the word out about Arturo Islas and the Rain God, because not enough people know about that.
Thank you.
You're a fan, right?
Cool. Okay, this is wonderful that he did this. So let me see if I have it right here. Yes, I do. Okay. So this is one of my favorite books of all time. This is The Rain God. Can you see my ring light's probably messing it up?
We can see it very clearly.
So Arturo Islas was the first Chicano to get a publishing contract with a major house, and he did not get that contract until 1991. And The Rain God came out, and it wasn't like widely known or anything at the time, but his work is exquisite. I mean, this is like the height of prose when I look at this. And I always told myself if I was ever successful as a writer, I would try my hardest to let people know about the Rain God, because unfortunately, right after he got his contract, Arturo Islas died from complications of HIV. And so not only did his work never reach an audience, he never even got to live to see the publications of these books in a large way like this. And he also wrote Migrant Souls. But there's also like a third book that's like an unfinished novel, And that's why I always tell my literary agent what she's not allowed to publish if something happens.
And how did you find the Rain God? How did you come across it?
So I was a Chicana and Chicano Studies minor in college at Metro State here in Denver. And I took a class called the Chicano Novel. And I remember somebody on campus had laughed at me when I said I was taking that class, because they said, oh, well, there's only enough content to fill like 2 weeks. And I just was like, there's no content because no one will publish her novels. Like, what are you talking about? And so Dr. Margarita Barcelo, she introduced me to his work, and she was actually one of his students. And she showed me this letter that he wrote her after she graduated. And he was just saying that he was really worried that he was going to die before, the book would be released. So I feel like he's one of my my literary ancestors, and I really do hope that we can see this work live again in a larger way.
It might be that you're on a one-woman crusade to have this happen. Maybe it'll happen, right?
They are. I think that it's being re-released by HarperCollins. I wanted to write the intro, but I told my agent, I was like, find them, but I think it's already printed.
Oh, that blows. You should be allowed to do the intro.
I told you.
What do you say we turn it over to other people? Because I think they want to ask you questions as well.
I would love that. Thank you all for watching this. Thank you for coming.
All of you who have questions, by all means, fire them at us through the chat, and I will read them with my best voice to Kali, and we'll see where we go from there. In the meanwhile, while they're writing, Kali, do you have any questions you want to ask us?
Yeah, I do have some questions I want to ask you guys.
There you go.
So right now, you're not meeting in person, right? You're only meeting. So you're workshopping each other's work and things together on Zoom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like a lot of fun, does it?
No, I think it sounds like things we have to do.
Right.
What are some of your favorite readings that you've had so far in the semester?
Well, one is this woman, Kali. I don't know if you've heard about her. She's been really good. We have that. We've had, what did we begin with? We began with Elizabeth Talent. We've done Jamel Brinkley. We've done Amy Hempel. We've done Danielle Evans. We've done Charles Yu. We've done some George Saunders. We're doing Alexander Chi and Gabriel Garcia Marquez next. So we've got a bunch of people coming. Right now we're doing student work though, mostly. And it is a little weird to be in Zoom mode. What constitutes a really good discussion in Zoom wouldn't constitute an adequate discussion in a regular seminar, right? Because everybody gets to say their one thing and then move on, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, in workshop, I would always hold out my one thing and I'd be like, boom, everybody. But then sometimes it wouldn't land that way.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, thank you guys for reading the work. I guess my questions for you then, are there any favorite storytelling modes right now that are not literature? Are you finding podcasts and film during this time, or TV shows? What are you consuming that's a storytelling mode? Well,
a group will assume that they're being asked as well, but I'll answer.
Okay, I'm asking.
It seems pretty clear that podcasting is taking up a giant chunk of what used to be readership, essentially, and it's quite powerful now. And in fact, it used to be when you talked about movies, I also teach movie courses as well as writing courses. And it used to be when you talked about movies, you'd sort of throw media in as though you're just being broad-minded, say film and other media. But now other media is, in fact, with this generation, probably more powerful than film. So that the podcasts or even just what's going on social media is more powerful and more ubiquitous than movies. Even the people in my movie classes are unfazed about saying they haven't seen a lot of movies. And that experience that my generation had of watching a movie from beginning to end in the dark is pretty much over. So, now we're in a situation where the experience is broken up into tiny little fragments, and the movie makers are very sad about that, but they don't have any control over it otherwise. But I also wonder what it means for our ability to concentrate and immerse ourselves in work, Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder because when I was getting my MFA and throughout my entire life, I've been told that short stories don't sell and nobody wants them. And,
Right.
all this about, it's just, we want to stay with characters for longer and longer. And now that I'm like getting out of the woods of this novel that I've been working on for years and years, I'm like, are people really going to sit down and read this really long book? And to me, it's only like 200 something pages, but to me, that's like the longest thing I will ever write because I love the short story form.
Right.
So I am always curious how readers are finding like the experience of reading a full novel right now compared to the short story or listening to a podcast or watching a TV show.
I mean, I think the novel is not being hurt because the novel they can pick up and put down as they want to, right? What the podcast has going for it is that unpleasant sense we all have in our culture that we want to be multitasking. So you get all of these people who are like, well, I'm going to jog and listen to the podcast, right? Or I'm going to work out and listen to the podcast. And that way they feel a little bit more efficient. But again, it seems to me a very different relationship to the arts, right? When you're sort of going, yeah, I'm burning calories. What did he just say? That kind of thing. That's a little, a story that I sometimes tell from my film class is that I was doing a course on motherhood and horror. And I make all of back before COVID, I made everybody go to the movies together to watch the movies because the idea was it's a communal experience, right? And you learn from other people's reactions. And the students were completely weirded out by that, right? They were like, we have to watch the movie together, right? But, they're Williams students, so they're willing to go along with it. They're like, fine, you say you want it. And I'm sitting in the back and one woman says, watching a movie that I thought was quite frightening. One woman goes to herself, this is the scariest movie I've ever seen, which is, of course, exactly what I wanted to hear, right? And so I'm just about to celebrate, and she takes out her phone and she starts texting. And I'm so surprised that I just whack her on the arm. And I go, what are you doing? And she goes, I'm texting. And I go, you just said this is the scariest movie you ever saw. And she goes, it is. And I said, is that what you're texting? She goes, no.
Oh my gosh.
And I suddenly realized that's a different relationship to the arts than I have, right? I always assumed that people would do that when they were bored.
Yeah.
This woman was like, this is amazing. Anyway, and you're like, whoa. All right, we have some questions. I've been talking way too long. Karen Shepard wants to know, can you talk more about how you taught yourself to revise?
Yeah. I have, here's some tricks for everybody. Go to the library when it opens up again. I don't know, actually, I'm deeply mourning the library because speaking of podcasts, I listened to some podcasts with you, Jim, and you are such a researcher. So I bet you miss being able to go as well. But I'm deeply saddened by it. What I did is I went to the library and I found the section on craft that I didn't know existed. And I got a bunch of the Grey Wolf Art of series books. So the Art of Time, and I got Madison Smart Bell's narrative design. And I just started reading craft books that had to do with what I clearly did not know what I was doing. And so I read a lot, and then I began to just completely diagram anything I read. So before, when I was reading, I was much more of just a reader. And then I became sort of like, I'm trying to understand the blueprint of this whole thing. And I would just mark up and tear apart stories, really hone in on one sentence and see what that sentence is doing, and obsessively rewrite my own like sections. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I learned that's a trick that I still use right now is if like a page was giving me trouble, I would remove it from the story document and I would put it by itself, and I would just work on it by itself for a while. And all of that, got me to the point where, I feel like all I've been doing for years and years is revising. And so like the idea of like coming up with new stuff is like, that's easy. I think writer's block maybe is revision block for some of us.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I think it kind of does. Arceline would like to know, what sort of fears and anxieties that you experience when you're writing short stories do you get past, and what keeps you writing?
It changes depending on my life stage. At the beginning, when I was first starting to write about these very sensitive thematics, domestic violence, mental health, alcoholism. I was very afraid that people would know that maybe I had experienced some things. And I think that is why I gravitated toward fiction. But even the mask of fiction was sometimes not enough, and it really scared me. And so after a certain point, I had to just start really accepting that, this is what the work that I'm making, this is all I'm capable of making. And when I withhold, it's usually not as good as when I'm forthright. And so I think it just had a lot to do with sort of accepting who I was as a person and being more comfortable with myself. And that happened as I got a little bit older. But yeah, and now my anxieties are more like, oh my God, am I wasting time writing a short story when I'm supposed to be finishing the novel? Why am I stopping and doing this? Which is something I just did recently, but it's okay. Because Edwige Danticat told me that I might have lost that story if I did not stop and write
it. See, she gave you permission. That's very nice. Georgia has a question that relates to your autobiographical comment earlier. She says, I would love to know how you draw inspiration from your life and home and past experiences while still maintaining your work as fiction, essentially.
Well, to me, the entire thing is 150% made up, because I have to do all the legwork of like organizing it and designing it. So even if I did have a sugar baby, there's no way that sugar baby episode of my life played out in the same episodic way that the story Sugar Babies played out. So that is completely 100% invention. And I think that we do that with our own lives all the time. Just even being able to observe the sky, the sunset's a very beautiful periwinkle color or something. And then you go and you put that in your short story. You are borrowing from your reality. You're plucking it out and you're putting it in, but that doesn't mean that it's autobiographical. It's just something that you're sort of leaning on. And so now I kind of think of my lived experiences that I feel inspired by. They're just sort of like, I'm like repurposing tools that are just like left all around for me. Just started.
Yeah. Bellamy would like to know how you create different narrators. Do you see traits of yourself in all the characters you create? Are some of them inspired by other people?
So one of my professors was the late Brad Watson, and he used to say in a workshop, like, of course it's me, like I invented everything. So I was like, so yes, I mean, they do come out of my mind. So in that way, like every single one of them is me, but they're also not me at all, because you would be real, believe me, I'm not as cool as my fiction. Like, like my family does not like me as much as I hope my readers like the story. But yeah, they're versions of me, but I also am inspired by ancestors. The story Sisters is based on my great grandmother's sister. I want to write a novel eventually about my cousin, who was my godfather, who passed away from AIDS. And my Auntie Lucy, who was sort of the matriarch of my family, she appears throughout Sabrina and Corina. So yeah, I'm always pulling from both the self, but also like the greater ancestral self.
We have a more complicated question coming up from someone who decides to remain anonymous. I'm curious about the relation between your interest in, on the one hand, origination, and then on the other, surrogacy, stand-ins, sugar babies, cosmetology, women looked at the same way, Rachel, porcelain bogarts. Is there something in that tension connected to your relation to fiction? So you have origination, like ancestral homelands and home on the one hand, surrogacy on the other. You interested in that tension, the questioner is asking?
This is not something I've ever considered.
That's why you come to Williams.
Thank you for, I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Well, think about the way, on the one hand, origination is all about authenticity, right? You're this thing that you come from, but then there's these surrogates, these sort of porcelain boga, they're not the real thing, right?
Dolls. Dolls. I'm very interested in dolls and performance, and that kind of thing. But I don't really see them as separate tensions. Like we sort of make up our earth too. We don't live just on the dirt. And even if we did, we would have a lean-to or some sort of structure that we were like using to make things up with. So I don't really feel that tension, but now that you've mentioned this, I might start looking for unconscious connections. Thank you.
Well, if you think about some of the ways your characters will do these paradoxical, lovely paradoxical things like perform honesty or something like that, right? The tension is sort of built into that in a way, but you're saying, but it's the same woman, it's the same person, right? Who's doing both.
Yeah. So I think, well, okay, so I think that's interesting what you're saying about like I was thinking about the Sugar Baby today because I was reading Alice in Wonderland because it was a childhood book that I loved, and the section where she's carrying around that little pig and she doesn't know what to do, and I was like, that's like me with my sugar baby.
Right.
And like I do think of fiction as like an artifice of like the story is fake.
Right.
And I think I like having these little nods to like this thing that you're reading is fake.
Right.
And I do think that as like a fictional mind, I'm interested in that. And it does show up again and again. And in the novel, they're performers. So there's snake charming and there's tea leaf reading and there's a lot of sleight of hand. So it is something that I think I'm going to be a little bit more curious about now that we have a beautiful question in front of us.
Well, what's fun about those gestures in your work as well is how much subversive play you build into it. So like, with the sugar babies, not only are they standing in for, well, this is clearly a construction, but you also have the protagonist doing things like drawing tattoos on it, and having the poor boy that she's partnered with saying things like, well, you make him look like a bathroom wall, right? You're not respecting this sugar baby. Kind of thing. So somebody's having fun, and I think that somebody is called Kali, actually.
Well, I mean, yeah, this is the only thing I know how to do, and I love it. And I laugh, and I cry when I write, and I just want to keep making things like
That's
this.
Great. That's great. All right, we have one more question, and then we can turn you loose to start drinking heavily. Shiara wants to know, during the revision process, do you ever find yourself liking your work less the more you read it?
Oh my God. Okay. Today I told my agent I think the novel's a pretty okay book, and she told me not to say things like that about
that marketing people don't want to hear that.
Don't say it's a pretty okay book.
Exactly.
I think, have you ever written your own name so many times that you can't even tell what your name is after you've like said it out loud, or you just keep looking at it, you're like, that amount of letters equals who I am.
Right.
There are times when I've been revising all day long and I start to feel like fuzzy brained and strange, and every sentence I've ever written is terrible. And that's when I know I really need to because I actually can overpick. And I joked the other day, it's like, you have like your mom to tell you when you're a teenager to stop picking at the zits on your face, but you do not have somebody like behind you at the computer saying like, stop picking at this paragraph for 50 minutes.
Right.
Like, trying to move on to something else. And so I try to, if I really hate something that I'm working on and I can't fix it right away, like it's just stopping me for some reason, I try to like leave it a little bit alone and come back to it. And then oftentimes I figure out that maybe I did not dislike it as much as I thought, that I was hungry or depressed, or I had just gotten like a bad phone call. And so I do think that the external world can sometimes change how you function as a writer.
Well, we're going to stop there, Kali, because you've been wonderful for a full hour, and we all want to thank you so much for coming east, even in this sort of weird electronic way. We're all big fans, and we're going to stay big fans.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. And I really appreciate you inviting me and you all reading my work and engaging with it. And this is just such an honor for me, Jim. I'm a big fan of yours, so thank you so much.
At some point, we'll have to give each other a hug in celebration.
Okay. All right. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, Kali. And thank you for everybody for coming.